Hello, and welcome to this episode of Rule of Carnage, a series of conversations, chats between myself, Glenn Ford, a games designer and developer, and my good friend Mike Hutchinson, also games designer, where we talk about designing better miniatures games. Um, so we've been talking quite a bit recently around the general subject of cursed problems, sort of uh, things in your game where you want something and it creates a problem with another thing you want, and how to deal with that. And a lot of them have been quite sort of clear oppositionals, so they've been sort of easy to talk about. Um,
hmm
we've been sort of putting off a general problem or a general ball of problems of high interaction multiplayer games. I'm going to sort of try and chat about that. So we're sort of putting this generally under the head of politics. Um,
Well, so give us a couple. We're gonna have to unpack a few terms, I think, to have the best conversation here.
yeah.
So when you say high interaction multiplayer games, so a miniature war game tends to be a high interaction two-player game. What do we mean by high interaction?
So high interaction is simply where I can directly, by my actions, remove your ability to win the game. So generally in miniatures games, this is shooting your stuff, killing your dudes, and then you can't do anything. So usually Euro games are low interaction games. So a lot of sort of like worker placement games and deck builders where the most interaction I can usually have with you in most Euro games is I might buy a card that you wanted, or I might take a space you're going to take, but I can't shoot your dude in a worker placement game. So you literally can't place your worker. It's very rare that I can stop you from being able to buy cards in a deck builder, like literally stop you from being able to buy cards. I might nick the one you wanted, but you'll still be able to have a second option.
Right.
Um,
And so it's very, very rare to find a miniatures game which could be described as multiplayer solitaire in the way that's sometimes you could look at a particular board or card game and go, well, we're just sort of doing our own thing here, and we're occasionally looking over to see what other people's game state is, but it's not interacting highly with us.
Exactly. So miniatures games like similar to things like sort of dudes on a map games tend to be very high interaction. I can absolutely stop you from being able to not just win the game, but stop you from being able to interact with the game in any way, shape, or form ultimately.
hmm
Um, high interaction games, particularly high interaction multiplayer games, have a little umbrella of problems. Like I say, that we sort of term politics. So politics is anything where, aside from the game that's being played on the tabletop, I can talk to the human beings that are playing the game and try and persuade them to act in a certain way. Um, and the big issue that people have with politics generally is if you have a high interaction multiplayer game, the skill of politics ends up being kind of the only skill that's really being tested. If I can persuade the other people around the table to do what I want them to do, then I inherently have so much power and influence that it overrules and overweighs anything that's physically happening on the tabletop, because suddenly I have like two or three people's worth of resources, and I can direct and manipulate what's happening on the tabletop. Now, if
So
what
what might have been a highly strategic game when it's one versus one becomes less about the strategy within the game and more about the conversation that's happening over the top of the game.
absolutely, and if your game is about that, like diplomacy is a very famous game, which is 100% openly just about the politics and the persuasion and the talking, and is brilliant for it. That's fine. If your game wants to be about the strategic and tactical maneuvering on the tabletop, then the fact that it is just about the politics is a huge problem. Um, and figuring
So
out
you
ways.
mentioned something that I just want to catch on it because we don't mention it that often. So you mentioned the skill that is being tested. So we talked about it in one or two previous um, videos, but like given that the game has a win condition and you need to take actions towards that win condition, you can be sort of more or less effective, more or less skillful at manipulating the game, depending on what the game is testing. And we talked about it a little bit. Maybe we haven't got into it in a super amount of detail. That like estimating where your pieces, where your minis are, and where the other guy's minis are, and how far they can move towards each other, and whether something will be in range in a couple of turns. Like there's a lot of reasoning about where the pieces are
Mm.
that gets tested, and like in complicated miniature games with lots of moving parts, like remembering and understanding how the interlocking rules feature, that's a skill that's being tested. And
Yeah.
what you're suggest and therefore like the better I am at that skill, the more likely I am to win more regularly. And what you're
Mm.
saying here is that in a high interaction multiplayer game, even if normally the game is about knowing what all the ad mech units like clever interactions are, it could just be about convincing the guy that's playing Space Marines to like lean on that side of the board rather than leaning on this side of the board.
Yeah, and I think the issue people have, I think, with politics is like, if we play Risk, it's about who's best at politics. If we play 40k multiplayer, it's about who's best at politics. We can play a range of games. We were hoping we're going to test different strategic and tactical capabilities. We were looking for it to test like resource allocation and sort of judgment of rates of attrition and all these sort of different intellectual and technical skills in relation to the game, and they all just end up being testing the same thing in the same way, which is, can I, well, that guy always manages to talk his mate into doing what he wants him to. It's like you'll often see people complaining about like, if you play at certain social situations, couples who always end up sort of backing each other up, and it's like, well, it's pointless playing a high interaction game with them because they always team up together, and so it always ends up being about that and not about what's happening at the tabletop.
And there's even a softer reflection of this insofar as like if you end up in that situation, even with a bunch of mates who know each other well and are like happy to, happy to sort of trade blows and not necessarily feel like they're doing politics, there'll come a point where, there's three or four of us, and like I'll have to make a decision about who I go after. And so I have to sort of come up with a lightweight rationale for why I'm doing it rather than attacking John, I'm attacking Glenn. And I come up with some kind of jokey rationale, and that's fine. But like underlying it, there's just a little sensation that like, the game's sort of I'm sort of swinging on this kind of decision here, and if I didn't make this decision, the game would come out differently. And so that's a lighter expression of it, but it still can lead to not necessarily a bad taste, but just like a kind of just a sort of funny like,
Yeah, and it can be tricky because it's like, you'll get some players who will take the attitude of, well, I try to sort of go, well, if you attacked me, that's what I let motivate me, because I think that's the sort of the role playing kind of
right.
response within the game. That seems like, well, that is a reaction to what's happened at the table. Whereas sometimes you can get the, well, we always dogpile that guy because he's usually better than the other people,
Right.
which oftentimes comes to a point where it's like, oh well, brilliant, now your game is about not being good at your game so that people don't think that they need to jump on you, and you get a weird inverse relationship of how you should play to win, and it becomes like a reflection of games that have very heavy.
Which of course is a good bit of politics. Like play like a dummy, don't look like the threat.
Yeah, and then you get sort of the thing like you sometimes get with games that have very heavy sort of rubber banding and stuff I think Power Grid is one that's sort of famous for this, where you win Power Grid by being the second place player, because it gives the second place players such huge like catch up rewards that you stay second place and then easily leapfrog the person at the last minute. And so it's a weird game where everyone's trying to pull back from getting into the lead, because then you don't get any of these boosts. And if you have politics, you have a similar situation where you've got like a whole bunch of people trying to look like incompetents around the tabletop so that they don't get piled on by all the other players. And sometimes if things go just right, it can be a nice balancing thing. Sometimes it just makes a game that moves very, very slowly because nobody's willing to take like an overly sort of powerful attack on somebody and show their hand as being able to devastate other people, and therefore take three punches to the head, in response for that.
So, Glenn, are there some classic solutions to this problem? If we've got our miniatures game and we'd really like it to support 4 players, but it is a shooting each other and punching each other's nuts off sort of a game, what options are on the table here?
So for the very basic general problem of politicking, the easy, well, not easy, but the standard solutions, I think for mini's games are objectives. I think is a major one, particularly like simple things like hold objectives, where um, you you have to get onto a certain point, and then once you get onto that certain point, you are obviously the target for all people because that point is the victory point mechanic. And so you sort of, it's similar to like King of Tokyo,
Mhm.
the board game, where you only score points by being in Tokyo, and as soon as you're in Tokyo, everybody else is allowed to hit you.
Yeah, and you see this in like free for all battle royale games in video games as well, where like you've got to like climb up a tower and stand on the tower, and it's going to tick a clock down, and if you can stand there for 30 seconds, you get a big piece of pie, but everyone's attacking you because you're on the tower.
Exactly. And well worked, it can be a situation where, unless people are absolutely entrenched in the politics of picking on a particular dude, that as soon as somebody gets like blasted off of the objective and somebody else takes their place, obviously the reasonable social rule is now start pummeling the guy who's on the objective and stop pummeling the guy who's come off of it. And that way you can sort of give people the sort of the correct justifications to
Mhm.
attack people at certain points, and players can feel like they have some agency in stepping down from being the person who's being targeted. And at that point, if somebody's still insisting, no, keep shooting the guy who isn't on the objective and isn't scoring victory points anymore, hopefully you give people enough sort of political ammunition to go like, no, you're just being a jerk now, guy. At this point, you are just like being
I mean,
unreasonable.
it's interesting that you bring up King of Tokyo because King of Tokyo takes it to a sort of abstract extreme where you literally can't interact with the person who's not stood on the tower, which
Yeah.
could potentially be an option. I've not seen it done in a miniatures game, but could be.
Um, I, I mean, there have been sort of one or two specialist scenarios, I think, that sort of had that situation going on where the person that everybody could only target the person in the middle.
Mm.
And you sometimes see that in things recreating a sort of desperate last stand where you're like, well, we don't
Right.
want to have one player need to get like 4 armies worth of stuff. But the point of this scenario is that one army is horribly outnumbered and has to sort of hold on against the weight. So you do get sort of one against many scenarios. There aren't many that allow you to switch back and forth and have the objective, the thing that sort of defines it, but it wouldn't be mechanically impossible. And another way of sort of doing this is, I think as we mentioned before in the pig in the middle, sort of, which is a related problem, is the thing that Triumph and Treachery did, where you know you can only target a particular individual. This doesn't necessarily work inherently with politics because you can still all target the same individual, but it is entirely possible to say, well, you can't target somebody who has been targeted already this round,
Right.
um, you know, or you can have a thing of, to some degree, randomly assigning the targets that people can choose at any given round. So there's sort of nothing illogical about saying, okay, well, if you've got 4 players, each round there will be one person randomly decided who you cannot target, because if you just say, oh, you have to target another person, like, well, that person just isn't an option for me, so I've got wasted turn. But
Mm.
you can at least sort of divide it out to say, where you can target two people or a certain percentage of people tabletop, because then you're likely to have something you can attack. But hopefully that sort of breaks apart some of those open or unspoken allegiances that might build up during a game. Um,
A similar one to the objective and tower thing is using a race metaphor where it's
mm,
clear who's in the lead, because then you get like an easy, well, don't shoot the back marker, that's just being mean. Do shoot the guy in front. That's definitely the thing that we should be doing. And you know, it's on the nose in Gaslands, but you can use that metaphor in lots of ways as long as the like current standing of players is really crisp and obvious at the table.
yeah, and I think this is one of the things that, one of the ways of helping avoid politics is by having a very readable game state in relation to winning and losing, and like the position of players in relation to be able to win or lose.
Mm.
Because it's one thing to sort of have like, VP, and have them very clearly marked and have
Which is
everyone.
odd, which is oddly somewhat in opposition to a two-player game where that clarity is sometimes designed around so that it's a bit more complicated because that's part of the strategic innie outie.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And this is one of the reasons it can be difficult to have a game that plays both as two-player and as multiplayer, because yeah, absolutely, in a two-player game you often want to obscure what one player is doing to score VP and make it difficult to judge where their strengths and weaknesses are, because if everything's too open and chess-like, the game can end up sort of becoming a bit banal. Whereas in multiplayer, it's much more beneficial to have things as open as possible, so that politicking doesn't become uh, sort of an overpowered ability. Um,
Mm.
and particularly, it's like it's one thing to have the literal actual scoring that is going on at the end of each round. This is how much VP everybody's got, but it can also be very difficult to tell. Sometimes the person who hasn't picked up the most VP is actually in the strongest position, because they've got themselves into a good strike position. They have very powerful troops left. The other person has basically spent out all of their resources pulling their 3 VP out, but is then not going to be able to do anything pretty much for the rest of the game, and
Yeah.
they're going to actually end up being last place. So sort of for multiplayer games, I think a more readable game state on multiple levels becomes much more important than in a two-player game, where, as you say, a two-player game will very often like consciously obscure the sort of the position and the strengths and weaknesses.
Yeah, so that you have to make
Their
some
player.
judgment calls with imperfect information.
Absolutely. So in relation to politics, one of the other problems, and this is relating to partly what we're talking about with team play, um, but it does relate back, I think, to sort of multiplayer games. Something that's often talked about is quarterbacking.
Yeah.
So, for those who aren't aware of the term, quarterbacking is a generalized game term for when one player points out the objectively correct thing for other people to do. And then those other people feel like they have a lot of their agency removed whilst playing. Obviously, if you're in a team game or you've got a cooperative game, quarterbacking can just basically remove all but one of the players from a game, and everybody else is basically being puppeted by the person who's just saying, well, no, look, factually, I can prove to you that this is the correct choice. I will show you the math. You,
Yeah,
you are
yeah, yeah.
literally a
Try playing Forbidden Island with a 5-year-old and a 7-year-old.
fool.
Resist your quarterbacking. Yeah.
Um, Whereas, it does relate to politics even in a multiplayer versus mode, because a quarterback can become somebody who is just objectively able to see what is factually the correct thing for a particular player to do, has a lot more ammo in pushing that player to do what they want them to do, because they
Right,
can
because they can hold their tongue when it relates to attacking them, but they
Hmm.
can point out clear advantages when it relates to attacking Glenn.
Yes, you can sort of objectively show somebody why they should definitely do what you want them to do. So I mean, I think quarterbacking generally is most significant as a team and co-op problem, and it is genuinely a sort of a quite difficult cursed problem because like what is good.
Or because we just talked about how we want open, readable game state.
Yeah, absolutely. We want it to be very open. We want it to be readable. We want it to be so that somebody can literally prove to somebody else that they should be doing what they want them to. Also, like cooperative games, team games at their best are about people on the same team talking through plans, communicating, and coming to sort of a joint conclusion as to what they should do. It's like if you play co-op games with people who are militantly against sort of quarterbacking, you have a point where you're all meant to coordinate and you stop and you sort of say, okay everyone, what's the plan for the turn? And nobody says anything because they don't want to be thought of as quarterbacking or pushing other people. And then you get a bunch of people blundering around guessing at where they should be and hoping me being here is useful,
Right, and I guess that's why, at least in board games, a lot of board co-op board games that are engaging with this as a design question, like deal with imperfect communication as a solution to that. And that definitely is a fun thing that's available in miniatures games as well. Like we've got the imperfect information of guessing a move or guessing where a piece could be. We've got, all the metaphors about like lost messages and, pigeons
yeah.
getting shot down delivering messages. So, whether it's because we're doing a co-op horror thing and we can't know where each other are, or that it's a, it's a co-op adventure game and we're yeah, so like
Yeah.
I think like controlling the way that information flows around the players seems to be a classic uh attempt to soften the ability for any one player to see the whole state.
Yeah, absolutely. I think like hidden complexity can often be sort of a real aid to this problem. Like uh Arkham Horror, the card game, um I think deals with this by simply having each other player's deck be so sort of complicated and so reliant on its internal mechanics that the other player can't really tell you what you definitely are able to do because they physically do not know your capabilities. And so
Mm.
you can have much more of a conversation about, okay, can someone take care of that bad guy? We need that bad guy taken care of. Meanwhile, somebody needs to do this investigation. I reckon I could probably do either of them, but I'm not certain. And if other people are, if someone's like, oh, I'm totally can crush that guy to death. And so like I think Hobgoblin has a good example of this with its fortune cards. Because in the team mode of Hobgoblin, your fortune cards are hidden from your teammate if you're playing teams, and can only be played on your teammates' units. So it gives you an opportunity to be able to say like, oh no, you can win that fight. Trust me, you are going to be able to win that fight. You might not think you can, but I'm just asking you to believe in what I can give you to
Mm.
sort of shift your calculations and your sort of understanding of the strategic map on the tabletop. And again, Triumph and Treachery has a set of a hand of hidden cards which can affect combats and such like, and so that sort of very much undermines the sort of the ability to quarterback a tabletop where if certainly once the quarterback once says, oh, you should definitely attack that thing because you'll easily defeat it, and then they attack it and the other person drops a powerful card which completely turns the combat, that kills any future quarterbacking that person's going to be able to do because they're just going to get reminded over and over about how very wrong they were sort of last time they attempted this.
So in the Discord for Space Kits recently, which is a game that is trying to be both highly interactive and very multiplayer. someone chimed in with like a, yeah, I've been thinking about this game end work that you've been doing, and do you know what I really hate is king making. And I've had a
Mm,
game recently where I was sort of piggy in the no, I was basically functionally out, but I could see that depending on whether I called I'm going to leg it now or in a couple of activations, I could sort of decide who was going to win by just
mm.
taking my actions in a particular time or a particular order. And they got, pretty passionate about how like they understand that kin making's a thing, but it really they don't like it and they don't want it. And if there's a way of designing it out, then that would be great. So
Yeah.
this is a kind of it's kind of it's almost like an emergent politics or a sort of or a political sort of like it's like a bomb that blows the politics up.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, king making is again, it's something that people really, really dislike. And the irony, I think, a lot of the time with king making is that the person who is doing the king making hates that they're doing it,
Right.
which is the weirdest thing about it. It's the one sort of piece of politics that even the person who's doing it as they're doing it can be very conflicted. So for people who aren't aware, king making in general terms is if there comes a point in a game where a particular player realizes that they aren't going to win, they're sort of functionally eliminated, but not like literally eliminated. Um, they can then throw their remaining weight behind a particular player or against a particular player, and change the result of the game. So it can push the second place player into first place. The old classic is when you realize that you're going to go out in Monopoly, and so you sell all of your property and all of your stuff to a particular player for like $1, and then that person suddenly ends up winning the game when they were losing prior to that. So the issue with king making is once somebody realizes they are essentially functionally eliminated from the game, they cannot get first place. Do they then do the sort of the noble thing and just and literally eliminate themselves from the game, intentionally step back from it, and allow the person who is currently in first place to continue to sort of, they've earned it at this point, they deserve the win? Do you continue acting as though you could still win, even though you're well aware that you couldn't? If the reason that the first place player is in first place is that they have pummeled you so severely, they've taken loads of VP off of you, should you then be like, well, the role playing thing to do is just
Yeah,
batter,
those are my VP. I'm taking them back.
yeah, attempt to revenge against the first place player,
And
even
in doing so, make the second place player win.
we win the game. And so it's tricky because it's hard as that sort of functionally eliminated player to know what the correct social thing to do is, what the correct sort of mechanical thing to do is. Are you meant to respond to the attacks that you suffered sort of in kind, or are you meant to start shooting for second place? So what you're meant to do now is start attacking the second place player. Are you always meant to attempt to improve your placement? Are you always meant to act as though you could win the game? It's genuinely for a lot of players, it's really difficult to know what to do in that situation. It's like if you realize you're in fourth place, should you target third place, meaning that he has no chance of winning because really nobody should be bothering to target him. um yeah, so it becomes extremely difficult for the player in that position to know what to do. And what a lot of players will sort of, do for one reason or another is throw their lot in with the person who is going to win or one of the people who are going to win, and claim a sort of spiritual victory by assisting them to their win, a sort of a thing that's nowhere on paper. And that can be very embittering for a first place player, particularly if they haven't attacked the person who is now functionally eliminated, to then see somebody who's in second place pushed past them, just so that the functionally eliminated player can feel like they have had a change and an effect on the game state. And
Hmm.
so it can result in a lot of sort of bitterness and confusion, and it can be very, very difficult, you know.
So presumably in terms of solutions, here we return again to unknown victory points, or like we don't currently know what the state is. Because if we don't know what the state is, you can't really king make because you can't read it. But then we get back to that other problem that we had.
Yeah,
This is a
yeah.
deliciously cursed problem, isn't it? It's
Well,
so
yeah,
cursed.
yeah. Multiplayer high interaction games, these things have their own names because they come up a hell of a lot
Yeah,
in
yeah,
these
yeah.
sorts of games. They're not.
So we can let's talk a little bit more about how to solve king making, but it feels like between these problems you sort of have to pick a lane and just accept that you're in that lane because you can't resolve all of these.
Yeah, I think that. So the thing about the most often sort of stated thing that's a good solution for king making is that once one player is functionally eliminated, the game is over. Once one player gets to a point where it is
So,
mathematically.
but that doesn't work if there's any way for a player to functionally eliminate themselves if they're smelling that they're like I'm not maybe expressing this very well, but like the problem with a player being able to eliminate themselves is if they're like just on the cusp, then they can decide whether to accelerate. If they can decide whether to accelerate to that towards that point or not, then they become
As it
another king making moment sneaks in.
But as in, like, what I mean is, as in, functionally eliminated being there is no mathematical way of a particular player still being able to win the game. So
Hmm.
let's say we've got a three-player game where we know there is a maximum of 30 VP. Let's
Hmm.
say they're sort of attached to objectives. And if it gets to a point where there are only 10 VP left, one person has 0 VP, one person has 11 VP, the game ends at that point
Yeah.
because the person with 0 VP is it's still in the game, has troops on the table, etc., but is functionally eliminated. They are
Hmm.
incapable of winning the game no matter what they do. Even though there's still 10 VP on the table, second place.
Yeah, no, no, I get it. And in that scenario, when the other two players have both got 9 VP, and I can decide whether to take an action to attack player B and stop them from getting that last 2 VP that they could just get over there, but maybe I can prevent them. Or I could not do that and not prevent them and throw my lot in the other direction. Like, even before the functional elimination, I've still got the king making problem.
Yeah, but the hope is that at that point that player's going, well, look, I could still win this. I know they're both on 9 VP and I'm
Oh, I
on
see.
0
Yeah.
VP. There are enough points on the table for me to win the game. I will attempt to, and at least
I see.
even if like it's unrealistic, at least the game is giving that player sort of hints of what the correct and responsible way of playing is.
I
And
see.
they might choose to sort of go against that and go, I know I technically on paper can win, but I'm going to choose to make that guy win. But that's the sort of thing that you really can't legislate against. But if we
Mm.
have a point where it's like, okay, so long as you mathematically can win, we all agree you should try to win. Then if we have a controllable level of VP where we can say, okay, once it is mathematically impossible for any one of the players on the tabletop to win the game immediately ends at that point.
Hmm.
Which can be tricky because obviously you then inevitably get a game that's sort of cut off halfway through, and it depends how valuable to you stopping king making from happening is.
Right.
But you can have more sort of soft limits on, what indicates that the king making position is going to be significant, rather than it being like, okay, there's an exact number of VP. We can have things like break points for forces, and once a certain player reaches a break point and then is forced to remove their forces because of like a morale test, that ends the game. And so
How does this scale with player count? Is it always the first one out?
I mean, I think like player elimination obviously is always a sort of a difficult thing if the game doesn't end with literal player elimination. So I would always suggest that if you have literal player elimination, the game should end when one player is eliminated.
Mm.
Um, and I think like a lot of the time that can have a beneficial like alternative balancing effect because if second place sees that one player is close to being eliminated and winning the game, it becomes very much in second place's interests to start protecting a losing player, um, which gives the losing player a bit more benefit and a bit more help and hopefully sort of helps to level things out. Obviously, if first place is far enough ahead that suddenly winning the game becomes about completely pummeling whoever's in last place, at least that tends to be a quick and merciful end, if nothing else.
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, look, politics, as an umbrella term for all of these problems, is an eternal issue for high interaction multiplayer games, which if a miniatures game is going to be a multiplayer game, it is absolutely going to be a high interaction multiplayer game. These are problems that game design have struggled with like constantly, and there are multiple attempts to try and fix it. The things that aren't sort of necessarily super helpful for miniatures games, but who knows, is like speed of decision making,
Mhm.
simultaneous decisions as simultaneous actions. So if you have some sort of hidden planning phase where everybody who has to do a certain amount of planning for what they're going to do without knowing what anybody else is going to do during that phase, that can be a very helpful way of dealing with it because you can't tell anybody what anybody else is doing, and the people are much freer to be able to completely ignore the politics that's going on in their ear. And a lot of the time at that point, because politics obviously relies on open verbal communication at the tabletop, the politicking player is just giving away what they're intending to do. And
Right.
if they're not, you can build up layers of like bluff and interaction. And I think this is one of the things actually that a lot of multiplayer games, multiplayer miniatures games, because sometimes they are a secondary thought onto the two-player game, they just try and achieve like a basic functional multiple people round the table version of things. And the fact that politics is always going to be there, but it can contain fun like lying and bluffing and manipulation. We've been talking about ways of controlling it, avoiding it, corralling it, and caging it up. There is the other option, which is like leaning into it and like encouraging people to be in a position where they're going to say something to openly give away what they plan for the next turn without any commitment to any part of that, and then have like a bunch of other players react to their claimed plans, and then we reveal what our plan is for the actual phase, and people get tricked or don't get tricked, and isn't that a delightful moment?
Hmm.
Like it's absolutely not a multiplayer game, but if you imagine something like X-Wing, where everyone's doing their dials and putting their dials down, and you imagine that with multiple players on units, and then people trying to tell each other, well, you need to do this because he's going to do that. Because one of the problems with a lot of these games is because
Well,
they're
that's that emergent complexity thing that you were talking about again, where it's like it's just too hard to politics because it's too hard to explain or know.
yeah, because these games tend to be open and turn based, and even alternating activation, where it's like, if there's four people around the table, player four gets a lot of ammunition to tell player three, look at what those two guys are doing. They're getting ahead of us. You need to go and do this and do that and react to that. Where he's sitting there, well, yeah, but obviously player four hasn't done anything yet, so
Mm.
he's always going to have that ammunition. So I think simultaneous choices, pre-planning, orders phases, all of that sort of stuff, I think are good ways of dealing with it. and also possibly leaning into the advantages of the problem. Right.
If you've ever played X-Wing multiplayer, drop a comment below.
Yeah,
I
how?
never have. Now that you've said it out loud, that sounds brilliant fun, and I want to do it multiplayer.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how it would work, but I think it feels like it would be a brilliant experience. You
Well,
should
the
definitely.
thing it's never occurred to me because, like, sure, there's scum and villainy, but there's only really two factions in X-Wing. We all know that.
I mean, I play scum and villainy, so
I
as
know
far as
you
I'm concerned.
pervert.
But yes,
Definition of is it a Johnny player? I think it's
no,
Johnny plays scum and villainy.
that's just because I'm contrary, and I turned up to the
Yeah.
club and asked what does everyone play, and no one played scum and villainy, so that was inevitably going to be the thing I was going to play, and nobody plays it because who knows what a quad jumper is, and who cares? Um, yeah, look, if you've played
If you care what a quad jumper is,
if
leave a
you
comment below.
if you know or care what the quad jumper is, please let us know in the comments below. If you've had high interaction multiplayer games and you've seen them sort of fall to the demon of politics, let us know about it. If you really enjoy a game that leans into the politics of back and forth round the table chat, if you think like bluff and counter bluff is the highest good in games, absolutely drop that in the comments, because I really love games that do that sort of thing well. It's just hard to do them well in miniatures games. While you're down there giving us some comments, give us a like and subscribe. And going to the links section, well, there'll be links across to various places where you can buy our games or support us directly on Patreon, and a link across to our Discord, where there will
New
be a
games, buy the new games.
by the very newest games. Yeah, you can swing by to our Discord, where people will be having multiplayer, high interaction things called conversations about this problem and others. But for now, I think from this episode of Rule of Conscience, be a thank you and goodbye. So, thank you and goodbye.
Goodbye.
Bye bye.
Glenn was king making there by he had the choice to end the episode.
I always have the choice to end the episode.
That's right. Well, I've got the record button.